Okay, well, it is a little bit after 2:30, so I'd like to go ahead and start, and thank you all for coming to see this fantastic panel. I'm very excited about this. We're going to start by giving a brief introduction to each of the panelists, and then they will speak a little bit more about themselves before launching into their part of the presentation today. We'll spend about 40 minutes on the presentations, and then we'll have a question and answer at the end. So up here in the upper right of the screen is Kathleen, or Kat Compton. She is the Pollution Prevention Program Coordinator for EPA Region 10, serving Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and 271 tribal nations. In her role at the Environmental Protection Agency, Kat supports collaborative projects with Region 10 state and local governments, tribes, and non-governmental organizations to advance pollution prevention and green chemistry innovation. She's most proud of her efforts to create the new Healthy, Resilient, and Sustainable Communities Grant Program. In its inaugural year, the HRSC program will support 7 grantees as they implement sustainability and pollution reduction projects in the Pacific Northwest. Kat graduated from Whitman College with a degree in geology in 2008, and she holds a PhD in geophysics from the University of Arizona. Welcome, Kat, and thank you for introducing me to the rest of our panelists today. Teresa Blaine at the lower left serves on the EPA Region 10 Sustainable Materials Management Team. She collaborates with and convenes federal, state, local, and tribal governments to develop, implement, and share upstream solutions related to waste prevention and reuse, specifically in the built environment. Teresa is also very interested and engaged in opportunities to reduce climate impacts from the materials and goods we buy and use. She holds a degree in environmental studies from Seattle University and is passionate about the EPA's mission. Shawn Wood at the upper right is joining us from Portland today. He is a construction waste specialist with the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. Shawn's 25+ year career has included transit planning, urban planning and design, and most recently, waste planning. For the past decade, Shawn has put his knowledge and experience in design, construction, and material reuse into policy efforts. Shawn currently oversees Portland's Deconstruction Ordinance, a first of its kind requirement for deconstruction of Portland's oldest and most historic houses. Welcome, Shawn. And in the center, lower level, we have Jackie Kerouac-Fram. She has more than 15 years of experience helping nonprofits thrive through stakeholder engagement, strategic collaboration, and continuous improvement toward equity and inclusion. Since March 2019, she has served as executive director at the Rebuilding Center, a climate justice nonprofit that builds community resilience in the Portland, Oregon region by providing access to low-cost, reclaimed home improvement materials and to skills building classes in home repair. so that people can perform their own safe, sustainable, affordable home repairs and improvements. Prior to this position, she was vice president at Focus in St. Louis. This is a nonprofit civic leadership organization where she led efforts to increase community support and engagement. Jackie has a PhD in American Studies from St. Louis University, where she has published at the intersection of urban policy and racial equity. She has spent her entire career in the nonprofit sector and believes in the power of communities to drive policy change toward justice. So please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. And we will start with Kat and Teresa talking to us from the EPA. So.
Great, thanks so much, Kirsten. And Teresa's going to get our slides up here. So can someone give me just a yes that you can see slides and you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks so much for having us today. Teresa and I are super excited to be here. We're really excited to be part of this presentation and to share with you a little bit about the work that we do at EPA to support climate resilience, especially through this concept of what we'll talk about, this embodied carbon concept. Next slide, Teresa. Great. So before we jump into the details, we'll spend a little bit of time introducing ourselves and the agency that we work for. So EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, is a federal agency established in 1970, and we are tasked to protect human health and the environment. That's our mission. It's one sentence. And a former EPA administrator, Gina McCarthy, used to say that EPA is at its core a public health agency. So it's our role to think about the ways in which our impacts impact air, water, and land, and how we can help protect and clean our breathing air and the water that we drink and the land that we live on, for the benefit of our own health and the health of the environment and the ecosystems that we support. So as Kirsten said, Teresa and I both work for EPA Region 10. We're both based out of Seattle, and we serve Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska states, and the 271 tribal nations that fall within that boundary. And we work on complementary programs. I work for the Pollution Prevention Program, and Teresa works for the Sustainable Materials Management Program. And she'll talk about SMM in just a second, but they're really quite related, and they're part of this sort of higher level hierarchy that we like to think about at EPA, the pollution prevention hierarchy. So this is a way to think about how we manage our pollution in a tiered approach. When you think about the reduce, reuse, recycle way that we think about recycling, those are listed for a reason in the way that they're listed, from most important to least, sort of least important or least impactful. So reduce is the number one action, and that's what pollution prevention is really aimed at doing. From a pollutant perspective. So the way that we think about it is that the best way to manage our pollution is to just not create it in the first place before it enters into a waterway or into our air, and we have to think about cleaning it up. So that's what my program focuses on. I help support businesses as they aim to reduce their pollution impacts on the front end, rather than thinking about treatment or disposal. And I'll just offer a little bit of background about me. Graduated from Whitman in 2008 in geology, and I would argue that it's really hard these days to get through a field of study without thinking about climate change or environmental impacts. It's certainly true for the scientific fields, but I would argue that it's probably true for every field now. And so climate impacts has really been at the core of thought for many of us on the call today, and probably you in the room. And so this drives a lot of the work that we do, and how I ended up at EPA. And so thinking about pollution prevention and climate impacts and the intersection of those two things has really driven a lot of my career. So I'll turn it over to Teresa to give a little summary about S&M.
Thanks, Kat. So sustainable materials management is a systemic approach to using and reusing materials more productively over their life cycles. And it represents a change in how we think about the use of natural resources and environmental protection. So when we look at a product's entire life cycle, we can find new opportunities to reduce environmental impacts, conserve resources, and reduce costs. But before we talk a little bit more about sustainable materials management and its framework, I want to touch briefly on greenhouse gas emissions, which impact climate change. So since the early 90s, the EPA has prepared the Inventory of US Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Sinks report. And for many years, EPA only really tracked the greenhouse gas emissions from those sectors on the left: transportation, electricity, industry, commercial, residential, and agriculture. But the EPA's solid waste program recognized that within this sector-based pie, there were also greenhouse gas emissions generated from the life cycle of goods and products. And those emissions are all embedded in all of these sectors, but it's kind of hard to tease out what that looks like. So we took a sector-based, so we wanted to look at this from a systems life cycle-based lens, which is illustrated here. And this approach shows us that 42% of greenhouse gas emissions are generated from the provision of goods and food. And what that means is that all of the greenhouse gas emissions produced in that previous slide, about 42% of those emissions are related to the life cycle process of getting something into your hands, like your cell phone or the roof over your head or the food on your table. This life cycle process includes material extraction, manufacturing, distribution, use, and that product's end of life, whether it be reuse, recycling, or landfilling. Within each of these manufacturing processes, there are resources used such as labor, energy, and water, as well as outputs, including greenhouse gas emissions and pollution. So EPA we found that the impacts were 42% through this report, but from a more recent report in 2019 from the UN Environment Program, the estimate of greenhouse gas emissions worldwide is actually closer to 53% from goods and food. But luckily, there's a lot we can do in the choices that we make to reduce those greenhouse gas impacts. And a good portion of those greenhouse gas emissions from this system-based approach are related to materials and goods that make up our buildings and infrastructure, which is the area that we're going to focus more on today.
Yeah, so let's make this real for a minute. So what Teresa just said is that 43% of all of the US emission comes from the production and transportation and management of essentially stuff, all the stuff around us and in our lives. So let's think about that concept in terms of a building. So I want you to take a look at around the room that you're in, whatever room that you're in. Just notice the space. And if I were to ask you to take a climate action right now in this moment, in this building that you're in, what would you do? So for me, I see lights on. I know my heat is on because it's cold outside today. The actions that I would take would be mostly focused on making my building run more efficiently, turning out the lights in rooms that I'm not in, managing my heating and cooling. And this is a graphic that you're looking at from our EPA Energy Star program, which is focused on energy efficiency. And I don't know how big your screen is, so you may or may not be able to see this, but on each of the appliances in this little house diagram, there's a little blue energy efficiency sticker. And that's the EPA sticker. So these are all really good real-time actions that we can take to reduce emissions in our home, in our workspaces, in the buildings that we inhabit. But now return to what Teresa just said, that 42% of our emissions come from the production and transportation and management of our goods and food. And that includes all of the stuff that's in the building. So it includes the appliances, it includes the chair that you're sitting on, it includes the computer that you're using to access this talk. And it also includes the materials that make up the building itself. And so I just want you to look around that same room and think about how knowing that changes the way that you look at the room that you're in. And if I asked you now, what climate actions can you take? How does it change your answer? Or how does it start to expand your answer? So for me, it makes me start to think about the life cycle of the building that I'm in. There are actions that I can take right now, energy efficiency, but what about all of this other stuff? Next slide. And so this is where it gets really helpful for us to define a few terms. If we're starting to think about the life cycle of building, we might want to block out the kinds of emissions from different parts of that life cycle. So when we think about turning out the lights, using efficient appliances, managing heating and cooling, what we're referring to is what we call operational carbon. So these are the emissions associated with occupying a building. They're the immediate emissions reductions that we can take in the building that we're using today. We can reduce our operational carbon. And I'll just pause here for a second and say, you'll probably hear all of us on the panel use words like carbon, operational carbon, embodied carbon. You will hear us say greenhouse gas emissions, and you will hear us say climate impact. You can think of those three terms as synonymous. So when I say carbon, I'm using that to be a shorthand for carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, climate impact. So, okay, operational carbon, we can wrap our heads around. When we think about the life cycle of building, it's helpful for us to introduce another term, which is embodied carbon. And these are the emissions that are associated with the manufacture, the transport, and the installation of the building materials themselves. This is the climate impact that each material carries with it, that it embodies. So the chair you're sitting on embodies a certain climate impact that it took to manufacture and transport that chair into the room you're sitting in right now, for example. Next slide. And so this is just another diagram of what we can think about as the life cycle of buildings, and when we wrap our heads around embodied versus operational carbon or emissions. The full life cycle of stuff, a thing, an object, includes everything from materials extraction all the way up to use and through use to the disposal and the management of that material at the end of its life. So embodied emissions includes extraction, transportation, manufacturing, transportation again, maybe, and then also end of life and management on the back end. Next slide. So when we think of that use case, this is where operational carbon, operational emissions sits. And so the little Energy Star box is sitting over the gray arrow for use. This is our opportunity to get really good at efficiencies in our buildings that we're in today. Next slide. And what we're going to talk about today is largely this end of life arrow, the brown arrow. So, you know, where are the carbon emissions reductions opportunities or climate action opportunities at this end of life stage? In a lot of ways, our business as usual approach to buildings is in many ways a single use approach. So yes, we use buildings for many, many years. We enter and leave them many, many times. But as you'll learn throughout the panel, a lot of the building materials themselves are really only ever used in one building before they're disposed of. So we're all comfortable with the idea of single-use plastic. Maybe not comfortable with the idea of it, but we understand what that means, a piece of plastic that serves one purpose and then it ends up in our recycling or trash bin. But how many of us think about a single-use 2x4 that is extracted and manufactured and put into a building, and at the end of the life of the building gets chipped up and is no longer a 2x4, becomes something different? So when I think about that and I think about this graph, this life cycle approach, I think, gosh, wow, there's a lot of effort and associated emissions spent on creating a building material that we only use once. And there's a lot of opportunities for emissions reductions. And then especially at this end of life, there are a lot of opportunities. Next slide. Okay, so we have an understanding of embodied carbon and operational carbon. Why should we care? Is this really that big of a deal? Why is this important? If we're thinking about a building that we're in today, it is quite likely that the operational emissions will far outweigh the embodied carbon impact. We're in potentially older buildings that aren't as energy efficient. And so there's a lot of opportunity here to get more efficient in the buildings that we already have. And so a building as usual might look something like this graph on the left, where the vast majority of the pie is operational carbon and you have a slice of the pie that's embodied. But the opportunity is in the operational space. Next slide. But as we get better and better and better at more efficient buildings, as we understand more about how to insulate, as we understand lighting and heating and cooling, the proportion of our emissions in buildings that come from that operational space gets smaller. And so then the proportion of the embodied carbon grows. So I hope that makes sense. If we don't, so think about it this way, if we don't change anything about the supply chain and we just get really, really good at Energy Star, that use gray arrow, then the portion of the pie for operational carbon gets smaller and the proportion of the pie for embodied carbon gets bigger. And this second graph is really where we are sitting right now. The organization called Architecture 2030 estimates that about 74%, that's 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings built now between 2020 and 2030 are going to come from embodied carbon. So we're already really good at energy efficiency. And the big next opportunity is this embodied carbon. So this is something we have to think about. Add on top of that we are rapidly urbanizing. We're a world that is building a lot of buildings. In fact, Architecture 2030 estimates that we're going to add 2 trillion square feet of buildings by the year 2060. I can't think in terms of trillion square feet. I don't know what that means, but that's the equivalent of building an entire New York City every month for the next 40 years. An entire New York City every month for the next 40 years. That is a lot of buildings. And that's a lot of embodied carbon impacts. And that's a lot of opportunity for climate action. Next slide.
So I hope that section gave everyone an understanding of the reasons why embodied carbon in the built environment is so important. And there are a number of ways that we can reduce embodied carbon related to buildings. And here are some things you could maybe consider, like, do we need to tear down the building? Can the building be adapted for reuse and maybe reimagined from a factory to a commercial use with restaurants and businesses? Could we maybe design the building so that the materials in the building can be reused in the future? Design for disassembly is what it's called. Could we maybe use less materials in the construction of the building so that we right size the materials to the project to reduce waste? Or could we salvage materials in the building to be reused in the future? And if we can't reuse those building materials, can we select materials that have a lower climate impact, such as low embodied concrete or materials that are made out of recycled content? So these are some important things to consider when you think about the amount of resources used and the waste that's generated from the built environment. EPA estimates that about 600 million tons of construction and demolition waste are generated in the US, and that was in 2018. And we should note that this is more than twice the amount of solid waste that was generated during that year. And that was about 292.4 million tons of solid waste generated in 2019. According to buildings.com, the average building demolition of the average American home of about 2,400 square feet would generate 186 tons of waste. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and what our fellow panelists will present on today is deconstruction and the benefits it can have in the community. So as we mentioned, one way to reduce embodied carbon related to building materials is to reuse them. But in order for those materials to be reused, those materials need to be recovered through deconstruction practices. But first, before we dive into deconstruction, a little definition of what demolition versus deconstruction. So demolition is simply just tearing down a building and sending those materials for or landfilling. And deconstruction is building disassembly and material salvage. It means taking apart or removing some building components for reuse. Deconstruction provides a lot of great benefits, including opportunities for job training. It prevents usable materials from going to the landfill, and it makes used building materials available to the community at an affordable rate. And besides the carbon benefits related to the reuse of building materials, there are additional benefits listed here related to health, jobs, the economy, and preservation. Another benefit of deconstruction and reuse is related to disaster resilience, and more notably, ongoing issues related to supply chain. Materials recovered from homes aren't shipment across the ocean in a shipping container. Materials recovered from homes often stay in that local community and can provide affordable materials for rebuilding and repair. In this example here from Hurricane Katrina, folks in the local community were able to use materials recovered from disaster recovery sheds from reclaimed materials. And if you're wondering what the impact of deconstructing a home is, you can see from this case study that from 4 homes, there were 44 tons of materials recovered for reuse. Here's another case study of deconstructed homes that sat abandoned from Hurricane Irma. Students from Rutgers University deconstructed abandoned homes in a floodplain area and used those recovered materials to create green infrastructure to reduce future flooding and enhance community resilience. And in this last example, in a Florida floodplain buyout area, an undamaged 1970s home was deconstructed and lumber was recovered from that home and used in the development of HUD Section 8 housing. Locally, in February 2021, the Washington State Building Code Residential Code amendment went into effect that allowed for the use of reclaimed lumber in structural purposes. And I mentioned that here because you might be wondering, gosh, you're taking out material from an abandoned home. Are we able to reuse that material? And there are codes in both Oregon and Washington State that allow this. So now I'll turn it back over to Kat, who will talk a little bit more about our grant program.
Great, thanks, Teresa. So just really quickly, what is EPA doing about all of this, or what small impact can we have in our local community to help support efforts to reduce carbon emissions? For us in Region 10, that meant developing a new grant program called the Healthy, Resilient, and Sustainable Communities Grant Program. We made 7 grant awards this year. And this is part of a larger theme within EPA. About 40%, nearly half of all of EPA's budget goes out into the communities in the form of grants. We, as an agency, make grants to state and local governments, to tribal nations, to nonprofits and other NGOs that are doing the important boots on the ground work of environmental protection. Because we recognize that they are key partners and they're important players in the environmental and human health protection space. EPA is a big federal agency. Oftentimes that means that we're not as close as others are to community, to the environmental challenges that community faces. And so these other organizations that we partner with and that we support through our funding are often really the best suited to make progress on environmental and human health protection, to solve the problems that the community is facing. And so that's what our role is. In a lot of ways, it's to provide opportunities to find organizations that are solving the challenges of their community and to support them with funding. And that's what we as an agency can do. So Teresa and I worked together on this along with several of our other colleagues in Region 10 to establish this new grant program. I'll drop a link in the chat so you can learn about all 7 grantees, but I just want to highlight 2 because they're related to this built environment space. The first you'll hear from a little bit later, the Rebuilding Center is salvaging building materials and providing them at low or no cost to community members in Portland, Oregon. And the other is the South King Tool Library, which operates much like a library for books, but just with tools to help reduce the cost and the number of tools floating in our community. One really interesting statistic that South King Tool Library shared with us is that the average handheld drill is in use for about only 30 minutes over the entire course of its life. So why do we each need to buy a drill if we're only going to use it for 30 minutes? We could borrow that and let somebody else use it, and then we're only using one drill rather than each buying our own. And so that's what the tool library does, as well as reuse and repair workshops and other pollution prevention outreach and education. So we're very excited to support them too. And then just to reiterate, we're doing this good work to find organizations and support them so that we can really grow our impact and help make those connections between the need and the funding source and the solution in the community. Next slide. So I'll end here just reminding you of this pollution prevention hierarchy or materials management hierarchy, that when we think about our built environment and deconstruction and the way that we use and reuse, hopefully, building materials, that concept still applies to items outside of our building materials space. Next. And so when I think about climate impacts from a supply chain perspective, like we've talked about, this has really transformed the way that I personally purchase, use, and dispose of the materials that come in and out of my home. Each time we click that buy now button, we are activating a global supply chain that includes extraction and transportation and manufacturing and end-of-life scenarios that each have a carbon, a greenhouse gas, a climate emissions impact. And so that can feel a little overwhelming to think about the materials that we use, the stuff that we have in our homes that we buy and use every day. But it also represents a lot of opportunity to think about the way that we manage our climate impact across that supply chain. Next slide.
So we're flashing some resources up here if you'd like to learn more about climate impacts from our goods and materials. And my colleague Kat will provide those links in the chat so you don't have to quickly jot them down. But we just want to thank you. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening to our presentation, and we'll hold questions until the end for Q&A. And now we'll turn it over to Shawn Wood, construction waste specialist at the City of Portland. He will be sharing about the innovative work that's been happening over the past 6+ years around deconstruction and reuse in Portland. But before I turn it over to him, I just want to take a moment to thank him for all the work and leadership in the deconstruction and reuse space in the Portland area. When I first got engaged in the built environment work in 2016, Shawn was just getting the Portland deconstruction ordinance off the ground. And he'd spent years prior working with the local community and industry to get this ordinance to a place that worked for all. And many local governments all across the country look to Shawn for his expertise in this area. And he's been very generous with his time and supporting other local governments and sharing best practices from Portland. And I personally have learned so much from you, Shawn, and I'm very grateful for your leadership in this area and for your humble inspiration you provided to so many, including myself. So with that, Shawn, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Teresa. That's really nice. And it's an honor and a privilege to be here with you all today, and the presentation that EPA gave, I think, was a great primer to embodied energy, and just fantastic. I know there'll be a recording of this, and I'll plan on sharing that for sure. So just real quick, can I get a confirmation that you all see my slide? Excellent. And we're not like in notes mode or anything, right? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Great. So I'm Shawn Wood, City of Portland. I work as a construction waste specialist for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And when I interviewed for this position, so probably almost a decade ago, maybe a little over a decade ago, the interview panel said, is there anything else you want to share with us, right, after 45 minutes of grilling? And I told them, everything I've done in my life has led me to this position, and I hope you will hire me. And that wasn't just like, making something up to try and get a job. I mean, from as long as I can remember, I have been all about construction and building materials and pulling stuff out of dumpsters. As a kid, I would, my friends and I would raid the local construction site, and we'd work through their scrap pile and find nails and plywood, and we built tree houses. Our house in Virginia had a developable lot next to it, and when I found out it was going to be developed, this is like when I was a teenager, I went next door and I tied ribbons around all the trees, all the native trees that I thought were worth preserving. And in hindsight, maybe I should have used a larger, brighter ribbon, because they didn't really pay much attention to it. But anyway, that's a little background kind of from where I come from. I live and breathe this stuff. When Kat said earlier, look around your house and, what would you do to mitigate climate impacts? And first thing you think of, I'm going to air seal, maybe throw in some extra insulation. But I'm literally, if I turn my head like 5 degrees, I'm looking at lumber that came from a deconstructed garage that is now bookshelving in our house. So anyway, this isn't just my job. It's kind of a passion. So all right, let's get started. Advance the slide. All right. So go back in time a little bit. 100 plus years ago, Portland and many West Coast cities were built using old growth lumber. So these were massive trees. These forests had stood for centuries. They were part of a larger ecological human ecosystem that developed well before these guys showed up with their dog and cut down this large tree. And very few old growth forests remain, but they're still standing in our houses. And that piece of wood there on the lower right is a 2x4. So we've been talking a little bit about 2x4s. That is 100+ year old. So it was, in a house that was built 100 some years ago. Slightly larger than today's 2x4, maybe by a couple millimeters. But there's 100 years of growth in that particular 2x4. So if you were to buy a 2x4 today, you might see 5 or 6. So it's very rapid growth, not nearly as strong. This material is sought after for its tight grain, scarce knots, patina, and character. And that's what a lot of our houses are built with here in Portland and other West Coast cities. And prior to 2016, and this is the predominant way that houses came down. So you saw some pictures earlier. This is mechanical demolition. It's a heavy piece of machinery that comes in, and its job is to smash the house and make the debris literally as small as they can make it. And they do that by crunching it up with the claw of the excavator, then literally driving over it to pulverize it more, and that gives them some height advantage so they can take down the taller parts of the house. And they want it as small as possible, because then they load it up into a drop box or a dump truck and haul it off. So you only want to make a few trips with that, so there's a lot of incentive to crush it. That also means that very little of it is recoverable for recycling or energy recovery, and a fair amount, if probably most of it, does end up in the landfill. After 2016, so late 2016, increasingly, this is how houses come down in the city of Portland. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, as EPA mentioned, deconstruction, the disassembly of a house, roughly in the opposite order, was constructed with a primary focus on salvaging material for reuse. And I want to emphasize reuse, not recycling, not burning for energy recovery, but actually using that material in new projects. And our effort kind of got started, unofficially, probably around 2013. And so you go back, we were recovering from the Great Recession. I was, myself and a colleague from our regional government, who's kind of a kindred spirit, we were meeting with the then executive director of the Rebuilding Center, and we were talking about, how could we get more deconstruction in Portland? There was some concern that mechanical demolition contractors were saying that they did deconstruction, and they recycled 100% of the stuff. And anyway, and the executive director of the Rebuilding Center said, I'm seeing a lot of demolitions. Like it's more than it's been. Like, am I crazy, or am I seeing a lot? And so I went back to the office and pulled some permit numbers, and sure enough, coming out of the recession, we started to see a really steep increase in the number of house demos. So again, 2013, we had fully rebounded from troughing in 2009, 2010. So we were already exceeding pre-recession numbers, and it was ever increasing. And it wasn't just 3 people in a boardroom that were noticing this. So we started seeing a lot more kind of community concern about demolitions in neighborhoods, and their concerns ranged from the loss of materials to the loss of potentially affordable housing, to loss of kind of the character and historic nature of homes, hazardous materials, you name it. And so this was like the media coverage, 2013, 2014, that lower right-hand picture. You might think that the notable thing is that there's a goat on top of a minivan. But if you zoom in on the top of that dormer in that White House in the background, there is a gentleman strapped to the roof of that house that is facing demolition. You can actually see a little bit of pile of debris where they started tearing the front porch off. So 25 years ago, it might have been somebody chained to a tree out in an old growth forest, and now we've got somebody chained to a house. And those same neighborhood groups, they would go to work in the morning, come home, and the house next to them was completely gone. You could literally get a demo permit the same day you applied, and that afternoon you could be tearing it down. And so there were a lot of concerns about that. Neighbors started to get organized. They started, making yard signs. They had kind of expose websites that would list what homes were coming down and when they were built, and some of the history behind it. And they started having basically like demolition forums where they would invite developers, folks from the city, from our housing bureau, to talk about this concern around demolitions. And I started talking about the benefits of deconstruction. So I stayed out of the conversation of should a building come down and focus more on how should a building come down. And that started to get a fair amount of traction, and that turned into, and this is such a long story. But the result of that was we found ourselves at City Council in February of 2015, and our mayor said, "I hear you, neighborhood folks. Deconstruction is an important alternative to demolition. Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, why don't you all convene an advisory group and come back to us in 3 months with recommendations?" And that was the, you know, lights going off, and the really big kind of pivotal moment that gave us the support we needed to do something officially. So we convened a group of developers, home builders, neighborhood activists, historic preservation activists, folks from the salvage and deconstruction industry, both for-profit and nonprofit, representatives from our permitting staff, regional government, county government. And we started meeting, we met probably a total of 25 times, but again, our charge was, how do we get more deconstruction in the city of Portland? And we went back in, I don't know, like probably around June, July of 2015, and we recommended a phased approach. So let's start off slow, small, take some baby steps, and then start to ramp it up. And it's kind of great being in a presentation with EPA, because I always kind of equate this to how EPA addresses fuel efficiency, right? So you don't tell the auto industry that, you know, starting next month you've got to get 50 miles per gallon with your fleet, right? You phase that in over time, and that could be a whole other conversation, right? But so what we did was a phased approach. Let's start off with voluntary incentive-based approach, then move into requirements that we could ramp up over time. So just like miles per gallon, ours translates to, you know, how many projects we're going to do a year. And I'll talk about a little of these steps here in a second. So in September of 2015, we launched a grant program. And the idea was, again, this is voluntary, it's incentive based. You know, we'll pay someone to do a deconstruction. We'll give them like $2,500, $3,000 to do a deconstruction to help offset any extra costs there might be. But in turn, we're going to get information. So we're going to ask, you know, how much did this cost? How many labor hours was it? What were mechanical demolition bids, so we could start to compare the costs? You know, what were lessons learned? Did you run into any unabated hazardous materials? So we get all this. We mine these projects for information that helped us when we went back to City Council with recommendations for a requirement. And then ultimately we granted around 25 projects, different amounts. And one of the in hindsight, one of the best things that we got out of that grant program was that it was a proving ground for some of the elements that found its way into the ordinance. So, you know, promoting the site with site signage, having to submit, you know, an application or form on the front end, maintaining receipts for the materials and disposal receipts, and submitting those at the end. All of those were part of that grant proposal or the grant program that translated into requirements. So in 2016, our advisory group, we went to City Council and recommended that we have a deconstruction requirement, so an ordinance that would require deconstruction for houses and duplexes built in 1916 or earlier, or if they were designated historic regardless of age. So that captured about a third of all of our house demolition permits in Portland. And then we had in that ordinance, we actually had a goal that was stated that we wanted to work to expand the ordinance to 1940, which would capture about 2/3 of all house demo permits by 2019. So that was our goal. We missed our goal just slightly. We expanded it in January of 2020 and advanced the year to 1940, and again capture about 2/3 of house demo permits. This is a really simple bar chart line graph, but it's fascinating to me. So the orange bars are total demolition permits, house demo permits for each year, starting in 2015 up to 2020. And so our ordinance went into effect in late 2016. So the green line are deconstructions. Late 2016, we only had a handful of projects fall under the ordinance. And that's because it was late in 2016, and then a lot of folks turned in their permits before the ordinance went into effect, so they could still mechanically demolish. So in 2017, we still start to see a little bit of leftovers from that. So statistically, 1916 should represent 1/3 of house demo permits, but we don't quite get there. We get 28%, again, because the folks turned in their permit prior to the ordinance. 2018, the first full year, or the second full year of the ordinance, we're right at 34%, so that's where we expected to be. Also in 2018, some new requirements went into effect that made mechanical demolition more expensive. Meanwhile, the cost to deconstruct was going down. So in 2019, we see, even though it ought to be like 33, 34%, it's 42%, and that's because it is becoming cost competitive. And that extra 9% or so are voluntary deconstruction. So they did not fall under our ordinance, but they still chose to do deconstruction. So that's fascinating to me. And then in 2020, that's when we raised it to 1940, typically captures 2/3, and boom, we're right there. Leading up to implementation of the actual ordinance, we held a contractor training in July, so that's right around when it was approved by City Council. We had until October, late October, to kind of get everything in place to have the effective date October 31st of 2016. This was a 3-day training. We had 16 different participants representing 12 different companies. 10 of those were either minority or women-owned or emerging small business, so they were certified companies. Their cost for training was covered by a city program. And at the end of that 3-day training, they did a skills assessment to demonstrate what they had learned in the class. And then most of those companies went on to get certified as certified deconstruction contractors to do the work under our ordinance. And then once the ordinance was in effect, we held a workforce development training. So launching, we had enough folks to kind of get off the ground, but we knew as we approached a busier summer construction and deconstruction season that we'd need more workforce. So we held a 12-day training that hosted 15 students. This was free of charge to the students. They actually received a stipend to help cover personal costs. And we prioritized participation of women, people of color, and other disadvantaged groups in the field of construction. And over half of the students were women from a local trades program that the Rebuilding Center works closely with. And then we had some folks that were recently coming out of the prison system that participated, and it was in March, and it was gross, and it was cold, and everybody stuck through it to the end. So 12 days, almost 3 weeks of taking down a whole house and working on 4 other houses during that time. Really inspirational. So benefits and outcomes. To date, there's been about 400 houses taken down using deconstruction as a result of the ordinance, and that translates to about 4 million pounds of lumber recovered for reuse. And I'm going to underline reuse again. That's, it's not recycling, it's not burning, it's not landfilling. And I know a lot about the lumber side of things just because we track that electronically versus other fixtures. And that translates to about 4,000 board feet per house of lumber that comes out of these structures. And the carbon benefit, we know this because our State Department of Environmental Quality did a fantastic research and report on comparing mechanical demolition to deconstruction using actual data from our first 35 deconstruction projects in Portland. And this gets down to the granularity of, where the materials go, how far away is the landfill, do they flare the methane that comes out of the landfill. I mean, really, really detailed. And the outcome is deconstruction nets a benefit of 7.6 metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And so what does that mean? About 600 cars removed from the road every year for a year. And then, we see a lot of press coverage, a lot of stuff about plastic, banning bags, plastic straws. And there was an article that was coming out of Palo Alto. They were looking at a deconstruction ordinance, and their city council on the same night considered like a bag ban or straw ban, and then deconstruction for everything, houses, commercial structures, everything. And the press coverage was all about the plastic straws. There was literally a sentence at the end of the article about the fact that you were going to have to deconstruct houses and commercial structures. And I was like, wow, that's crazy, because you'd have to avoid 5.4 million straws to equate to one house deconstruction. So we recycle our bottles and throw away our houses. That's crazy. There are preservation benefits. We're preserving our built history, craftsmanship, the materials that go into these houses, old growth lumber. That's a Kawani water heater garbage burner, that middle black industrial looking thing. That was in the basement of that house to the right. You can't pick that up at Home Depot. As EPA mentioned, there's more jobs, at least six more jobs for deconstruction than there are for mechanical demolition, but that's really focusing just on the project itself. There's the residual benefits of, not only the deconstruction, but the fabrication of that material and putting it back into use, the retail jobs. It's a lot bigger, I think, when you look at it than just six. Our deconstruction workforce, at least of a couple years ago, is 35% people of color and 16% women. Mentioned earlier, the cost of deconstruction has come down while mechanical has gone up. And then the holding costs, we sometimes hear, deconstruction takes longer, so that's going to impact my construction schedule, it's going to cost more. That's not supported by permit data. So when we look at permit data, the deconstruction projects actually get their permit quicker, and they are ready for new construction, whatever is replacing it, quicker than mechanical demolition. It's really, it's quicker by like 4 days, but the real thing that drives the construction schedule is the permit review for whatever it's getting replaced with. So the site sits vacant, whether it's deconstructed or demolished, for quite a while they're waiting for that new permit. So there's plenty of time to do deconstruction. We currently have 15 certified deconstruction contractors, a majority of which are either women-owned, BIPOC owned, and we've had 2 new salvage retail stores open up because of the ordinance. Product development, research, everything from furniture building to siding and wall cladding. Oregon State University, one of their students in the forestry products division, took some lumber from deconstructed houses in Portland and fabricated some mass timber panels, some cross-laminated timber panels. Those are pictures of those in the middle. And then, both our regional government, our state government, and now the federal government has been really supportive of helping nurture this growing industry. So lots of different grants and support that is still ongoing. This is one of the new retail outlets. That tabletop there has a series of 7 panels, and each one of those panels represents a different house, the first 7 houses that were deconstructed under the ordinance. This is another one. This is Goodwood, and they formed, again, because of the ordinance, and then pretty quickly opened their own retail store, and they're starting to add value to that lumber. So you can buy the lumber, essentially exactly how it comes off the site, but they've started milling it into different profiles for wall cladding and siding. And that's a picture of them on their first job site in the snow. Just some additional eye candy of some of the material and furniture that's made out of this this old growth lumber. And Portland, we've done I think a really good job of institutionalizing deconstruction, right? So today a majority of houses have to be deconstructed when they come down. So we've transformed that, and that means there's a lot of supply of material, and Portland enjoys a fairly robust demand for vintage materials, salvaged wood, used building materials, but we've started to bump up against where supply meets demand. So how do we increase demand? We've got a new zoning code incentive that rewards projects that you use FSC recycled or salvaged wood. As Teresa mentioned earlier, both Oregon and Washington have building code changes that allow for the structural use of salvaged wood. And then we're also just starting to dip our toe into city procurement opportunities. So this is an example of a material that is made from plywood that was bound for either burning or the landfill, and it's resawn, cross-laminated, pressed, and it's a fantastic product that can be used for countertops, tabletops, wall partitions, and our bureau actually has just completed construction of a new building, and will occupy one of the floors, and those two right side pictures are tabletops that were sourced from this company, which is a black-owned company here in town. So it's, how can the city play a role in increasing the demand and creating opportunity for these companies? Some more eye candy, just how the wood is used. I want to highlight that one picture, kind of upper right next to the art. That is a sleeping pod that we partnered with Rebuilding Center. They supplied most of the material, so I would say 95%, 98% of that sleeping pod was constructed of salvaged building materials inside and out. And they coordinated a lot of volunteers. I volunteered. We spent 3 months building that sleeping pod for a houseless village for women called Kenton Women's Village. And so it's, some of this stuff is high-end, gorgeous executive, boardroom table type thing, but it's also, it supports a lot of great projects and people. And this is my final slide. Portland was the first one to codify deconstruction. It's been happening for a long time, but it's kind of underground. And Portland just celebrated its 5-year anniversary of its deconstruction ordinance on Halloween. And these are the cities that have started to make real strides towards either codifying deconstruction, having incentives or grant programs, that they have executive orders from their mayor. I'm talking about Pittsburgh. All starting to really formalize deconstruction, and these little dots, they pop up weekly. So probably I think it's tomorrow. I'm talking to City of Missoula. They're really interested in doing something like this, and it's every week that So you're only going to see more of this. And you can see a cluster of dots kind of down San Francisco Bay Area. And that can be highly attributed to EPA's efforts down in Region 9 in the Bay Area. So they have just been this great champion and have allowed it to spread nationwide. And what started off as really this regional conversation now includes like 500 people from literally all over the globe. So anyway, that's it. I will pass it off to Jackie with the Rebuilding Center. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, thanks, Shawn. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yes, stop share.
Okay. I will try to go quickly here because we're running out of time and I want to make sure we have time for people to ask questions. So my name is Jackie. I'm the Executive Director of Rebuilding Center, which is a climate justice organization in Portland, Oregon. The Rebuilding Center has been around for almost 25 years now, and it is an organization that exists primarily to make reuse and repair accessible and affordable for all. We do that through a couple of ways. We have a large 35,000 square foot retail store. You can see a picture of some of our staff here. We also offer classes in home repair. So I'll go over a couple of those two areas in a little bit more detail here. So the store sells donated reclaimed materials and home improvement materials at deeply discounted prices to make sure that everyone can afford to participate in the reuse economy. Whether you're trying to build a shed for your backyard or repair something in your home, do some remodeling, that you can choose to reuse if that's something that is important to you, or in many cases, if it's all that you can afford. We accept more than 3 million pounds of donated materials each year, keep that stuff out of the landfill and put it back into the community. We also offer repair education, skills building classes. More than 160 classes per year. We teach all sorts of fun skills, from intro to carpentry to plumbing repair and electrical repair, drywall repair, wall framing, tools usage, all sorts of stuff to help people become more confident in their skills and abilities to do their own home repairs and maintenance. The average tuition for a 3-hour class is only $75, so it's pretty affordable, although it's not, that price point is still high for some people, so it's not free, although we'd love for it to be someday. So given all of that information, we've been around for a long time, but as you might have been able to tell from Shawn's presentation and from Kat and Teresa's presentations, the market is changing. There's a lot that is changing in the world of reuse in terms of making markets for it, essentially, whether people are able to buy it, who's buying it, who's using it, what products are they making out of it? Are those products accessible to people who don't have a lot of money? One of the things that we're concerned with is that for example, the deconstruction ordinance, which passed in Portland, which is amazing and a model for national replication, has meant that there's a lot of deconstruction firms who sell their own lumber in order to make their business models work, which means that it's not often available for reuse by people who don't have a lot of resources anymore. So we're trying to find ways to make sure that reuse is still not only beneficial environmentally, but it also helps contribute to economic and racial justice as well as a practice. So we started exploring in 2021, is it enough for our mission impact to keep material out of the landfill? Is that enough? A lot of this stuff is not leaching chemicals. We're not burning it. It's just, it's just going to a landfill. And is keeping it out of the landfill enough of an impact for us? What are we doing with the material when we get it? And who are we aiming to serve? What impact do we want to create? So these are a lot of the questions that we've been asking ourselves as an organization. And it's interesting in this context of carbon management because, there are things that we can do that help mitigate climate changes. And then there are things that we can do that help mitigate climate changes while centering the needs of people who are most vulnerable to climate disaster, and even the smaller changes that happen with the current climate crisis. So climate justice work is climate mitigation work that prioritizes the needs of people who are most at risk of harm from climate disruptions. In the past, Rebuilding Center has done a lot of climate work by teaching people how to reuse things, by making it available and accessible, keeping all this material out of the landfill, and preserving the embodied carbon that is in those materials, which is really wonderful work, just all by itself. But given, you know, what we feel is our call to also address economic justice and racial justice issues, which are all bound up with climate justice, we've decided that our mandate now is to work toward climate justice by using the power of reuse and repair to address the needs of these people who are most at risk of harm from potential climate disruptions by helping them maintain safe and solid homes. So that's the new direction that we're taking. We're taking a lot of really great work from the past and providing a new context for it and providing a new mandate for it by thinking about how do we take this work that we've been doing for a long time and make it have even greater community impact. So our new vision going forward is that Rebuilding Center helps homeowners and renters living with low incomes to stay in their homes for longer, more safely, more sustainably, and with dignity. And that means that our old metric of success has to change. So we used to talk about how much material we keep out of the landfill. We keep 3 million pounds of material out of the landfill, full stop. Like that's our accomplishment this year. And that's amazing. And it is amazing. But now our new metrics for success include how much material we actually circulate back into community. Not how much we take in, but how much do we put back out into use? Because if it's just sitting in our warehouse, it's not really doing anybody any good. So how do we put it back into the community so people can make use of it, continue its product life cycle? And how well do we meet the needs of homeowners and renters living with low incomes who want or need to repair or improve their homes? So we're shifting a lot of the way that we think about our work here. And how are we going to do that? So we're going to secure higher quality code compliant materials as best we can. We have a few different avenues for doing that so that people who want to be able to repair their homes, especially if they're facing code violations, which could end up having them lose their homes in the end, that they can actually come to us and find materials to do those repairs and reach compliancy with building codes. We want to offer free delivery to transit dependent customers so they can come and shop with us and not have to worry about getting their stuff home. We want to offer classes that better address home repair and maintenance needs. And we want to secure funding to donate materials directly to individuals and provide free repair classes. So we're taking a model that has worked for a long time and really thinking about how to make sure that people with low incomes are not left out of the benefits of reuse and have the opportunity to participate in this movement with us, and that the movement benefits them as well. So one of the first things that we've done is we have this new vision, and so we applied for funding from the EPA to increase reuse of construction waste to benefit vulnerable communities. That was the official long title of our project. And basically what the EPA funding is allowing us to do, which we're very grateful for, is to partner with the city of Portland to create an information campaign that will go out with every permit that's issued to increase material donations. So encouraging more people who are taking things out of buildings through deconstruction to donate them for community use. Sometimes these things end up in landfills, sometimes they end up in warehouses. Sometimes it's because they don't know what to do with it or how to donate it or where to put it. So the city is going to step up efforts to really educate folks about how to enable reuse, how to make the best use of these materials that they're taking out of houses, and also materials that they've ordered for construction jobs that are left over at the end. And we're going to take those materials into our store, into our classes, and we will sell some of them, but we will also be able through this program to donate a lot of materials this year to people who are facing code violations and need some materials to help them repair their homes. The city of Portland has a program called Empowered Neighborhoods that helps people who have code violations and need support to come to compliance and get their homes repaired, which is not just a matter of being compliant with code, it's also a matter of having a safe home. If you have code violations, your home probably isn't safe for you either as an occupant. So making sure it's not just about meeting the city's standards, it's about really having a safe home and making sure that people who have low incomes can afford to have a safe home. So we'll be donating materials to those folks as part of this program. So we're super excited to get started. That program will start in March and run for 8 months. And similar to the beginning of the city's deconstruction program, it's a pilot, and it's going to help us learn what types of materials people really need, how well of a job do we do in securing those materials for donation back into community, and how much response do we get to this information campaign, which will help us understand whether it really is an information barrier or if there's some other reason why contractors and developers are not donating to us at the rate that we hope they would. So just to sum up, we sort of have a new North Star here at Rebuilding Center, which is when we're searching for climate solutions in general to center people most at risk of harm from climate disruptions. And also, we always talk about on our staff that it's important to consider that there is enough for everyone currently without further exploiting resources and people. As a culture, we need to relearn how to reuse and repair. These are practices that have been around since humans started. I mean, really forever. It's only in the last century or so that we've gone out of the habit of reusing and repairing and being grateful for the things that the earth gives us. So there is enough, and we need to learn again how to reuse and share the resources that we have already pulled out of the earth at great expense and destruction. So, in the end, the biggest question we can ask is how do we make better use of the materials that we already have instead of taking more? And we are super excited about the work. This is the work of 2022 for us. And yeah, check back in 8 months or so and we'll let you know how it all goes. Thank you very much.
That was just fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to switch us back to the gallery view so we can see all the panelists. For those of you online, would you please use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screens to submit questions? I will ask those questions and the panelists can answer them. So this is time for a short Q&A. We also have people in the room. Do any of you have questions? I'll bring you the microphone. Okay.
My question is primarily for Shawn. I was just wondering if you had a sole focus on salvaging lumber or if you're also working to salvage like HVAC and plumbing materials as well.
So great question. I tend to focus on wood. Primarily, we found with that DEQ research that's just by weight, that's the majority of what's salvaged from houses. So it's not to say that bathtubs, kitchen sinks, plumbing fixtures are not salvaged. It's just that wood is the predominant. It's like 90+% of what's salvaged, and we track that electronically, so I can report on. I know how many lineal feet of 2x8s or 2x4s were salvaged from a particular house, and what you're seeing today. So with what I shared and then what Jackie shared is kind of the full ecosystem. So we've got several companies that focus primarily on the lumber, and that's because there's a lot of monetary value associated with that older growth stuff, but there's newer growth, less costly material, and then fixtures, plumbing fixtures, lighting fixtures, cabinets, stuff like that, is where the Rebuilding Center plays a really large role in that ecosystem. So they're accepting that material that may be harder to sell it in a store, whereas that's already their model, is to provide these at low cost compared to new retail. So yes, it's whatever, we essentially leave it up to the contractor. What they feel like they can either donate or sell is what they salvage. So something like asphalt roof shingles, that goes in the drop box. That's not salvageable for reuse.
Thank you. Do we have another question? A couple more questions.
My question's mostly for Kat and Teresa. You mentioned working with the tribes within the region, but I was wondering their specific involvement, if any, in deciding where the grants from the EPA go.
Yeah, so the pollution prevention program offers grants to states and tribes. And our role is to create sort of the bounds, the themes of those grant programs. And then it's really the community's role to identify how they're going to implement a project that's going to be of most use to them, that meets the boundaries of the grant program. So for pollution prevention, you have to be doing something that is what we call an upstream approach. So you can't be focused on recycling, you can't be focused on composting, you really need to be focused on innovating a system that reduces pollution before it's created at all. So that's sort of the boundary. But within that, there's a lot of innovation that can happen depending on the needs of the community themselves. So for example, the Healthy, Resilient, and Sustainable Communities Grant Program that we created in Region 10, we said it's got to either be pollution prevention or it has to fall within the Sustainable Materials Management Program that Teresa works for. And then we got applications from all across the board. So Rebuilding Center, South King Tool Library in the built environment space. We've provided a grant to a tribe in northeastern Washington to do a lot of food recovery work. They're going to be collecting food scraps from the casino that they operate. Those food scraps are then going to be processed in a way that they become food for a pork farmer. And that pork farmer is going to raise pigs that they're going to then sell back to the casino and serve in their restaurant. And so we're building a circular food economy through this grant program. So it really depends, EPA has statutes that we adhere to. And so if you're working under the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, there are certain boundaries that those grant programs will have, but then it's up to the community to decide how they want to implement that work.
We have another question on the floor, and then we'll go to the Q&A online.
Hi, so this is definitely very broad and can vary. I was curious if there's a certain percentage of a house that is salvageable.
I can tell you from where I sit that so excluding concrete, right? So if you took a house and lifted the wood framing off of the foundation, because that concrete that makes up the basement and flat work and stem walls weighs a lot. And so take the wooden structure with all the stuff inside it, and just from basically the wood and fixtures, plumbing fixtures, lighting fixtures, cabinets, we're typically seeing about 25% of the weight of that structure being salvaged for reuse. The remaining 75% leaves the site and goes to a recovery facility where it's sorted for recyclables. And what that means is, any kind of metal is going to get sorted for recycling of metals. Any wood that's not treated or painted can be chipped up as what's called hog fuel and burned for energy recovery. And then what remains would go to the landfill either in it or sometimes even on top of it, which some circles consider that recycling. It's called alternative daily cover. And my thought is if it goes on the landfill or in the landfill, it's the landfill. But anyway, from just a reuse, just purely reuse, it's about 25%. And there are emerging markets for shorter pieces of lumber that can start to increase that. So typically 4 foot or longer is salvaged, but there's some development in industries here in Portland to use shorter segments and get those back into circulation.
Thank you. I think we have another question or two for you, Shawn. So this one is, how does the age of the house affect the feasibility of deconstruction? Do you see a future where a smaller amount of salvageable materials can be pulled from each home? That is, we start to use MDF instead of old growth. And that's a question contributed by Nick Bader.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Our ordinance was focused on the oldest and most historic buildings. So that's, if you look at the spectrum of, oldest buildings to one that was built yesterday, those older homes have higher value materials, so that old growth material, and they're also easier to deconstruct than a more contemporary house. So those newer houses are physically harder to deconstruct because of the use of adhesives. So people apparently really hate squeaky buildings, and it scares them, and they think there's ghosts in the building. And so if you go on a construction site today, they put all this construction adhesive coming out of a caulk tube on all the floor joists, and then the subfloor goes over that to eliminate the squeaks. So imagine trying to take that apart. And so we focused on the lowest hanging fruit that was the most fruitful. And then, over time, it would be great to advance beyond kind of post-war, beyond pre-war houses and get into post-war. Once you get into those newer houses, I think the strategy changes somewhat. So the value isn't in the individual parts, it's in the actual full wall assembly. So you've got potentially wall assemblies that meet current building code in terms of insulation and materials. And so there have been projects that you panelize that wall, crane it off onto a flatbed, and then reassemble it off-site as another structure. So it becomes less about the individual materials and more about the sum of them.
I'll just add to that really briefly that this is where some of that life cycle thinking comes into play as well, because as we're thinking about constructing new buildings, what we do at the end of the life of that building can factor into the way that we design our buildings on the front end. So this is sort of the upstream pollution prevention approach to design work. We can think about how to build buildings that are easier to deconstruct or easier to reuse on the back end. So building that in on the front end can really help, address some of those issues. The embodied carbon of a building itself it really is dependent upon the design choices on the front end. Once it's built, that embodied carbon impact is pretty much locked in. And then there's opportunities for sort of an honorable management of that embodied carbon at the end of life. But we have to think about how we design buildings with that in mind if we're going to really address embodied carbon.
Well, panelists, I would like to thank you and say that I have at least half a dozen questions, so I could stay here for a lot longer, but we are technically at the end of our time. And I just want to thank you for coming and sharing this really interesting story with us that I think has so much potential to spread elsewhere, and also becomes more of interest to us as we own houses or think about what our housing situation is in the future. So thank you so much again for giving us your time today. And thank you to those of you in the audience for coming. Really appreciate sharing this time and information with you.
Kirsten, can I just say one quick thing before everybody signs out?
Sure.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say that, you know, a lot of what we're talking about today is market-driven solutions, which, you know, some would say, well, that's the only way that this is going to happen. But I actually, you know, perhaps I'm idealistic, but a lot of the work that the ReBuilding Center is doing and going to be doing going forward is going to be trying to generate greater public and governmental support for this work, because there are ways to incentivize reuse that don't rely on market-based solutions, which often leave people behind who can't afford to participate in those solutions. So for anyone who's listening and thinking about how to do this work and how to do it better and more equitably, that's one area that you can definitely think about placing your focus, is lobbying your officials, getting them thinking about the power of reuse and repair and its importance in getting us out of this climate mess. So thank you for allowing me to jump in with that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Maybe a round of applause from the people in the room. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Applause.
Thank you.